This is a map of every Greggs in England. At first glance, nothing surprising. The nation's favourite bakery, cheap sausage rolls, queues out the door. Everyone loves Greggs, right? But everything changes when you look at it per person. Suddenly there's a divide. Greggs in the north, and in the south a different chain emerges. Pret and Manger. Fresh sandwiches, oat milk lattes, £5 for a soup. A slightly different vibe. Now, on the surface this seems trivial. 2 bakeries, 2 different lunch options, who cares? But here's the thing, pull up a map of average incomes across England. Same divide. Pull up a map of housing costs. Same divide. Voting patterns, health outcomes, life expectancy. Every single time, the same invisible line cuts the country in half. And the north is consistently on the wrong side of it. No other G7 nation has a productivity gap this steep over such a short distance. Drive 2 hours north of London and GDP per person drops by almost a third. That's not a regional quirk, that's a structural fracture. And a bakery map, of all things, is one of the clearest ways to see it. So the real question isn't why Northerners love Greggs, it's why that map keeps appearing, no matter what data you use to draw it. To understand the divide, you have to go back to where the North story begins, and it begins with coal, iron, and the Industrial Revolution. The north of England sits on top of enormous natural resources, coal in Yorkshire and Durham, iron ore across Lancashire and Teesside, gas, steel. The raw materials that powered the entire Industrial Revolution were buried under northern hills, and the cities built on top of them became the engine of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Sheffield is a good example. In the early 1800s, it was a quiet market town of local steelmakers. By the 1870s, it was producing nearly half of Europe's entire steel output. The US imported 3 times as much rail track from Sheffield as it made domestically. Manchester was doing the same with cotton, Sunderland with coal, Liverpool with trade. By the late 1800s, around 40% of all global manufactured exports came from Britain, and the vast majority of that came from the north. These weren't just factories, they were entire ecosystems, stable jobs, enough to raise a family on a single income, generation after generation. Towns built around industries that seemed permanent, the kind of certainty that makes you put down roots. And that certainty is exactly what made the collapse so devastating. Because the same system that made the North prosperous also made it fragile. The skills were specialized, the infrastructure was built for one purpose. And when the economics shifted, when wages rose, when foreign competition arrived, when it became cheaper to make things in other countries, those skills couldn't easily be transferred anywhere else. By the late 20th century, wages in London were nearly double those of major European competitors. British goods had become expensive to produce, and rather than gradually building new industries to replace the old ones, Britain made a clean break. That break came under Margaret Thatcher. In the 1980s, she made a decision that would reshape the country permanently. If Britain couldn't compete in manufacturing, it would compete in finance. The Big Bang of 1986 deregulated financial markets almost overnight. London transformed. Services jumped from 22% of GDP in 1979 to over 70% by the 2000s. For London, the gains were immediate and enormous. House prices exploded, wages surged. New restaurants, new shops, new infrastructure. The city became a global financial centre almost overnight. For the North, it was a different story entirely. Manufacturing went from around 30% of GDP to just 16%. Manufacturing jobs collapsed from 7.1 million in 1980 to 4.4 million just 10 years later. And these weren't unskilled jobs. Some required over a decade of training, but they simply weren't needed anymore. The workers left behind couldn't easily retrain. The new economy, finance, services, tech, created far fewer jobs, paid much more per job, and located almost all of those jobs in the South. By the 1990s, the Southeast alone held 5 times more high-paying service sector jobs than the entire North combined. And here's where it stops being history and starts being the present, because the gap didn't stabilize, it kept growing. Since 2000, over 300,000 Northern graduates have moved south. Nearly half of young people in the North plan to leave. Job growth since 2004 has been less than 1% in the North, compared to 12% in London and the South. Poverty rates are 5 points higher in the North. Life expectancy is lower. Children are more likely to grow up in low-income households, need free school meals, and leave school with worse grades. If you're finding this depressing, you're not alone. And if every Northerner who's ever thought about leaving subscribed to this channel before they pack their bags, we'd have numbers that would make even a London banker jealous. Hit subscribe. You clearly have good taste. Health alone accounts for around 30% of the North-South productivity gap. Fixing it could add £13 billion to UK GDP. That's not a rounding error. That's a policy choice being left on the table. And the brain drain makes everything worse. The people most likely to start businesses, drive innovation, create jobs, they leave. And they build their companies in London instead, which makes London richer, which attracts more talent, which makes the North relatively poorer. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, and it's been running for 40 years. Politicians know about this. They've known for decades, and they've responded with a reliable sequence of events. A catchy slogan, a big announcement, and then very little actual change. George Osborne had the Northern Powerhouse, Boris Johnson had Levelling Up, each one promising to finally rebalance the economy, to invest in northern infrastructure, to give the region a genuine shot at competing with London. Each one quietly fading once the political moment passed. The structural problem is that London dominates everything. It has the population, the money, the media, and, perhaps most importantly, the people who write the laws. London receives around £12,000 of public investment per person compared to £8,000 in the north. Of course, London has higher poverty rates, higher crime, higher costs, so a higher spend has some justification, but the gap in investment compounds the gap in outcomes year after year. HS2 is the most recent example of how this plays out. A flagship infrastructure project sold explicitly as a way to connect the north to the national economy, to bring Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds into closer orbit with London. The parts connecting London were built first, polished and finished. The parts meant to actually connect northern cities to each other, cancelled. The south got another piece of world-class infrastructure. The north got a broken promise and a hole in the ground. So, is there a way out? Some economists argue the answer is deliberate decentralization. Moving government departments, research institutions, and major employers physically out of London and into northern cities. It sounds radical until you realize it's exactly what France did with several of its major institutions, and what Germany manages naturally through its federal structure, where economic activity is distributed across Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Berlin, rather than concentrated in a single city. Others argue the answer is targeted investment in the things that compound over time. Fast rail connections between northern cities, R&D funding that stays where it starts rather than migrating south, and procurement policies that seed entire supply chains rather than just individual projects. Both of these require something British politics has struggled to sustain for 40 years. A genuine, long-term commitment to a goal that won't pay political dividends until well after the next election. The bakery map is still there. Greggs in the north, Pret in the south. It's been there long enough that people have started to think of it as natural, as just the way things are, rather than the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments in history. But economies don't have to look the way they do. They look the way they do because of choices, and choices can be made differently. The question is whether anyone in power actually wants to.